Hey everyone, I hope everyone is doing great. I wanted to hop on today and talk about all things short-term rental, right? We're going to talk about the advantages, the disadvantages, what constitutes a short-term rental, and how you get started, and how to actually see if this makes sense for you in your portfolio. So let's start off with why short-term rentals. And for those of you who've been in this space, you've probably heard a lot of people that you work with, or a lot of people on the groups talk about short-term rentals a lot, especially since the pandemic. And it's been kind of crazy. But there are a lot of reasons why everyone is almost jumping onto the short-term rental ship. And we're going to talk about the most important, pertinent reasons why that's happening. And for most of us, the reason we're investing in real estate is because we really want to get to financial freedom. We want to accelerate to financial freedom. And short-term rentals are one way that you can really add momentum to your financial independence journey. And the reason is because with short-term rentals, unlike with long-term rentals, all of a sudden when you get started, even in this crazy hot market, you are able to have significant cash flow from day one. And so when we're talking in terms of numbers and we're talking in terms of return on investment, we typically talk about cash flow as cash on cash return, which is where you're taking cash flow, you're dividing it by your initial investment, expressing it as a percentage. So you're actually seeing what your returns are. And when you talk about short-term rentals, all of a sudden now, instead of seeing anywhere from 2 to 8% in terms of cash on cash return for long-term rentals, you're suddenly seeing up to 30 to 40% cash on cash returns if you have a short-term rental that you're self-managing, or upwards of 15% in terms of cash on cash return when you have a property manager. So all of a sudden, instead of getting, say, a few $100s to $500 in cash flow every month from a property that you would see with a single family long-term rental, you're suddenly able to see anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 in cash flow from a single short-term rental property. And when you actually think about that, what it does is that it really supercharges your journey to financial freedom, right? All of a sudden, you're seeing this life-changing cash flow come from one single property. And that could mean that you can cut back your time at work if you wanted to, go down to part-time. Your spouse may be able to do that. So suddenly it's able to give you the freedom to make choices differently, right? So that's one of the biggest things, right? The cash flow that you're seeing with short-term rentals is suddenly significantly higher, and it can transform the way you structure things. But another big advantage of investing in short-term rentals, and if you're doing this right, so it has to work with the strategy. If you could buy it given its location and the market that's in. You could buy the property as a vacation home, and then all of a sudden you're able to get owner-occupied financing, but more importantly, you could put in lower down payment. So instead of saving up 25% for a down payment on a long-term rental that's an investment property, all of a sudden you're able to go in with a 10% down payment, which means for some of you where you're trying to spread your money out and really leverage yourself and try to get to financial freedom faster, that can really help. And for those of you with a lower initial down payment where you're struggling to find the money, this strategy can make a lot of sense in terms of having the money to purchase your first property, and also in terms of getting a higher return from that property, right? So that's another advantage of investing in short-term rentals. And then a big one where I see the biggest transformation in terms of what a short-term rental can do for you is that suddenly when you buy a short-term rental, if you decide to self-manage it, and we're going to talk a little bit about self-management of short-term rentals, we're going to talk a little bit about the criteria you need to meet to be able to take advantage of this. But if you are active on your short-term rental in that year that you purchase the short-term rental, right? It doesn't have to be forever, for a certain period of time. If you're doing that, all of a sudden you're able to consider that a business, and you're able to create huge losses from depreciation, and we'll talk about it more in detail. But what you're essentially able to do is you're able to shelter a significant portion of your clinical income, your W-2 income, or any other earned income that you're making. So you could shelter hundreds of thousands of dollars of your income from taxes. And when you put that into perspective, what it essentially means, and we've had members in our community do this, members who've been in the Creating Generational Freedom program, they start off with one short-term rental. That's the first one they're doing. They usually pick something that they can have some personal use with. So it's not just an investment property. It's also a place where they can make memories and that they can use themselves. So they go in and they purchase a property, put a down payment on. One of our members did this. He put $35,000 down, used the 10% financing, got a short-term rental, had a lot of fun rehabbing that property, making it their own space, and then listing it. But because they were active in that short-term rental in the first year, they were able to shelter, I think it was close to $120,000 of clinical income from taxes in the year that they purchased the short-term rental. And so what it meant was the post-tax dollars saved, they were able to save close to, the post-tax dollar saved was close to $52,000, which was significantly higher than their initial down payment, and they were ready to take that money and just keep growing their portfolio. So many advantages to a short-term rental, things that you don't really see with a long-term rental. Now, in terms of those tax savings, if you were to do that for a long-term rental, you suddenly need to meet certain other criteria. So you actually have to be spending more time in real estate than any other profession or any other source of income that you're generating. So you have to be spending more time in real estate. You have to be spending at least 15 hours a week on your real estate portfolio, or in a real estate trade or business. So many other hoops to jump through. But with a short-term rental, very easily, people who are just starting out are able to effectively use the strategy to generate that cash flow that makes so much more sense, and they're able to save their shelter their clinical income from taxes, which for high income earners can be huge. Right. So yes, this is so amazing. So why isn't everyone just building a portfolio of short-term rentals? Like everything, when you have higher reward, there are also downsides that you need to consider, at least in terms of risk mitigation. So let's talk a little bit about that. Right. So in terms of what the cons, or what things you need to take into account when you're considering investing in a short-term rental, the first thing I always say is, think about the amount of time that you're willing to put into it, right? Most typically, a long-term rental portfolio, you're easily having a property manager on there, and you can be completely hands-off, and they're possibly charging 10%, in terms of their property management fee. With a short-term rental, it can be close to 30%. So a lot of us may want to self-manage those short-term rentals. And so where with a long-term rental, and guys, I always say this, if you're spending more than 2 hours a week on your real estate portfolio, be it long-term or short-term rentals, then you really need to tap into more efficient systems. So, you shouldn't be spending more than that. With a short-term rental, with a long-term rental, hopefully you're spending maybe 15 to 20 minutes a month on your portfolio, and that's how you have it structured. But with a short-term rental, you may decide not to have a property manager in place. You may want to do it yourself. You may want to, at least the first few weeks, even if you're self-managing and you have systems in place where you're only spending, so sorry, it's like life happening around me, my cleaners and my gardeners. But with a short-term rental, even if you get to the point where you're only spending 2 hours a week on your portfolio self-managing, the first few weeks may be a little more hectic because you're furnishing it and you're listing the property. So you may be a little more hands-on with a short-term rental, and that's where that effort reward spectrum comes into play. When you get higher rewards, you may be putting a little more effort into it. But again, especially if you want to tap into those tax savings and you really want to, in the year that you're acquiring it, maximize your tax savings, you're going to put a little more effort into it. But the point remains that you could easily have a short-term rental where you could generate upwards of 15% in terms of ROI annually just from cash flow. So 15% cash and cash returns or higher, even if you have a property manager in place, and then ideally you're buying in the right markets to do that, right? And some of our members also choose to purchase short-term rentals that are already furnished, so they're not going crazy with furnishing it and getting an interior designer involved. So there are ways around it, but again, when you do that, you lose out on the tax savings. So it's you get to pick and choose what makes the most sense for you, but you need to start out with that in mind. I always say start off with the end in mind. How active do you want to be? Run the numbers according to that and make sure it makes sense for you and for your lifestyle, right? Now, the second thing with short-term rentals, in terms of planning ahead of time before you get into it, is understanding regulations. And this is really important. We've had members who choose not to stick with the typical short-term rental markets, or they want to explore a different market. They start putting in all the hard work only to realize later on that there are restrictions in terms of what can be operated as a short-term rental in a certain submarket within a certain neighborhood. So I always say, when you're starting out and you're trying to pick markets, make sure you're completely aware of what regulations are in that market. That's in terms of the city, right? So you can call the county clerk's office and you can try to understand what the zoning regulations are. Also in terms of HOAs, and this is more of an issue in metro markets when you're trying to invest in a short-term rental where there are a lot of residential properties, because obviously they're trying to protect the residential properties and the interests of the residents. But you want to make sure you really know what the regulations are before you go in, right? And then the other thing is, again, it's that spectrum where when you get higher returns, you're obviously assuming slightly higher risk. And with short-term rentals, the risk comes into play because short-term rentals essentially are a business, right? So, and that's why you're able to get past the real estate professional status, the criteria you need to meet for that. The reason you're able to easily qualify to get your tax savings from depreciation on your short-term rental is because it's considered a business, and therefore it's not, housing like a long-term rental. So whenever you have economic downturns, generally in the market, if there's an economic recession, you may see a drop in revenue from your short-term rentals. That happened during the beginning of the pandemic because everything was shut down, and that could happen every time you have economic changes, and that's something to keep in the back of your mind, and which is why it's just important to run your numbers conservatively. So those are some of the things that I won't call them really disadvantages, but things I think you should keep in the back of your mind when you are considering a short-term rental. And that needs to go into your strategizing, right? Because the first thing is strategizing even before you pick a market. So all of this, how much effort you're going to put into it, the regulations, understanding the risks, running numbers conservatively, knowing all of that is really important before you pick the market where you want to invest in short-term rentals, right? Okay, so we talked about what are the amazing benefits of investing in short-term rentals? What are the things that you really need to be cautious about when you invest in short-term rentals? So now let's go more into the logistics, right? So what exactly is a short-term rental? Now, it's classified differently by different people, but what we are most concerned about is how the IRS classifies short-term rentals, right? So the IRS says that any property where the average guest stay in that calendar year is 7 days or less, that's considered a short-term rental, right? And there is a second criteria, which I don't want to get into because I don't want to confuse too many of you, but if you have a 30-day stay, it could be average guest stay less than 30 days as long as you're providing substantial services, but it doesn't apply to most of us. For most of us, it's going to be an average stay of guest stay of 7 days or less for that property to qualify as a short-term rental according to the IRS. Now, when it qualifies as a short-term rental, remember I said you need to, if you want to take advantage of those advanced tax strategies where you're using losses from your short-term rental to cover or to shelter your clinical income from taxes, thereby paying lower income taxes in that year, you would need to meet certain criteria. That's called material participation. And so when we talk about losses in a short-term rental, it's important to remember that these are pseudo losses, right? Your property is generating cash flow, high cash flow, and your property is not losing value. If you're buying it right, the value of your property is likely increasing over time. It's in a strong market. That being said, you can still take something called depreciation on real estate, which is a paper loss where the IRS says over time you can show a loss, so they consider a building basis of your property, and the building basis, without considering the land, is depreciated over time for a short-term rental because it's considered a business. It's depreciated over 39 years, and when it's depreciated over 39 years, every year you get to take a certain portion as losses. In year one, you have the ability to really supercharge those losses and accelerate those losses and take a large loss, and that's what you hear people talking about when they say, I got a short-term rental and I was able to shelter $100,000 of my or $200,000 of my clinical income from taxes, and I was able to save more than my down payment, right? That's what happened. So they're using depreciation, they're using accelerated depreciation. To be able to do that, though, you need to meet criteria. That's called material participation. There are 7 criteria for material participation. You only need to meet 1. I'm only going to go over the top 2 criteria that most of our members use to be able to hit material participation. You either spend 500 hours in that calendar year on your property, to say that you're actively involved in your short-term rental business, therefore you're eligible to take those losses against your earned income. Or you spend 100 hours on your property in that calendar year, but you're spending 100 hours or more, but you're spending more hours than anybody else on that property. So that includes your property manager, that includes your cleaner. You need to be spending more time on that property managing it than anyone else, right? So if you meet either of one of those 7 material participation tests, and I talked about the 2 most common ones, then you're able to generate losses from your short-term rental that saves you money, which you can then use to grow your portfolio and accelerate to financial freedom, right? So that's the nuance, the way the IRS looks at it, and the criteria that you need to satisfy. But apart from that, another important thing when you're thinking about this is to pick the market that makes the most sense to you, right? So you're going to be thinking, okay, what kind of short-term rental market do I pick? And remember, there are different kinds of short-term rental markets, and for all of you, a different market may make sense. I always say, if you're picking a market, if you can have some personal use, that makes sense, because then it's not just a financial decision, it's also a lifestyle choice, and it's all about building those bonds. So if you can find a market where you think you would be using it, that'd be great. But apart from that, there are 3 main criteria for short-term rental markets. The first one being our fly-to markets, right? So that's like Hawaii, Orlando, where people fly to these destinations, and they tend to be great markets, but typically when there is an economic downturn, those markets tend to be the ones that get hit the most often, because people aren't taking expensive vacations where they're flying to those destinations, right? The second category is your drive-to destinations. Now, drive-to destinations are destinations where, it's close to a metro market. People drive there easily within 2 to 3 hours. That's like Blue Ridge, your Panama City Beach, Destin, Florida, your beach destinations in Florida, the Smokies, where, those are your typical drive-to destinations, which are very, very popular. And especially during the pandemic, they did really, really well. And then the third category is going to be your metro markets, right? So a metro market is where you have like a city like Bakersfield or Houston or Dallas, and you have short-term rentals in those cities. And they've done really, really well also, especially since Airbnb, has, I think 2015 is when Airbnb started taking off. So many people now, especially since the pandemic, want to stay in, even in these metro markets, want to stay in those short-term rental spaces as opposed to hotels. So those are the 3 different kinds of markets, and you can pick and choose the one that makes the most sense to you. Apart from personal choice, I always say pick markets that are really strong, where there are good regulations already in place, so that when you get in there, you're not going to be challenged if the regulations change. And then a lot of our members within the Creating Generational Freedom community, they like picking metro markets, and I like metro markets too. And the reason is, when you're picking a city where you have a short-term rental, it can generate really good cash flow, but you also have an exit strategy. So this is like a two-edged sword, right? If you pick a metro market, there is possibly a higher likelihood of regulations changing. That being said, regulations do change in vacation markets also, but with a metro market, you have an exit strategy. And I always say, if you are picking a city, a regular residential, proper city as your market for a short-term rental, you can. I always suggest running numbers for long-term rentals also, to make sure that it functions well as a long-term rental. Now, so those are the 3 different kinds of markets: your fly-to markets, your drive-to markets, and your metro markets. And you pick the one that makes the most sense to you, right? And always make sure you start off by understanding what the regulations are, and making sure the regulations that are in place and the ones that are proposed and are predicted to come into effect are favorable to you. Remembering at all times that the IRS considers any property with average guest stays of 7 days or less to be a short-term rental. You want to make sure you're going to be able to do that successfully. And then in terms of running numbers, so I picked a market. Now, how do I know if this market makes sense, if this property makes sense for me? That's where if you have a property manager who works primarily with short-term rentals, they may be sending you their own spreadsheet, and all our agents who work in short-term rental markets always do that. They send you their numbers, but I always say you're better off running your own numbers. So for those of you who are thinking, how do I run my numbers? I have, if you go to the resources section of Generational Wealth MD, there is a free short-term rental calculator that you can use to run numbers, and everything else is mostly very intuitive. The only data that you really need before you can run numbers for a property, for a short-term rental, different from a long-term rental, is going to be your ADR, which is the average daily rate, and your occupancy. All right, so these are the two numbers you need. AirDNA and Matchvisor are really good sources to grab this data. So you could just go onto AirDNA, put the property address in there, go to the Rentalizer tool, and make sure you have the correct number of beds and baths in there. That's something you need to do. And then look at the ADR and occupancy, take that and then plug it into the calculator and run your numbers and make sure that property makes sense. Now for short-term rentals, at least in our community, we like to see anywhere from upwards of 20%, definitely, and most people see 30 to 40% in terms of cash on cash return, which is your ROI from just cash flow in a given year. You want to see that when you're self-managing the property. And then if you have property management in place, you have to plug those numbers in. It can be anywhere from 15 to 30%. You still want a cash flow at least above 15% because you are putting a little more effort into it, right? So it makes sense. You value your time. So you want to make sure the property functions appropriately. Okay, so that's it. So we talked about the nuances of short-term rentals. We talked about the pros and the cons. Now the question always is, should I invest in short-term rentals? And I really honestly feel that for most people there is a place for short-term rentals in their portfolio. For most of us, it could just be a short-term rental in a portion of your home, in an ADU that you have. It may be a vacation home that makes sense for you that you can use with your family. But for most people, especially when you're starting or scaling, short-term rentals really help you because they give you that life-changing cash flow. Some of our members have generated 7 to 10,000 a month in cash flow just from one property. And this is cash flow after all expenses are deducted. So, it can really, really transform your financial freedom journey. You have the ability to leverage yourself up. And, for those of you who've heard me talk before, leveraging yourself increases your returns and really helps you scale faster as long as you're responsibly leveraged. Most of these short-term rentals are single family homes where you're getting long-term fixed debt. And so if you can put 10% down and really make those numbers work, that's just beautiful. Then you factor in the tax savings. Again, that is, I always feel like if you can keep money in your own pocket and keep scaling your portfolio, that is just amazing. So you have the ability to do that if it makes sense to you, right? And then, like I said, if you are someone who's super conservative and you're still finding it hard to make that decision, you can pick a metro market to have your short-term rental in. A lot of the teams that we work with, they work in metro markets also, where your property functions really well as a short-term rental. But if at any point, and then we have property managers who help manage it also, right? So you can be as hands-on or hands-off as you want to. But if at any point you want to convert that to a long-term rental, the numbers would make sense as a long-term rental also. So you have an exit strategy built in. So that's for the really conservative people out there. You could still use the strategy, just be creative about it. And this also helps all of those who are thinking, markets are crazy, interest rates are going up like crazy. How am I supposed to make the numbers work? This is how you make it. You pivot, you use different strategies, right? I was talking to someone today with the same questions, and I said the multiple strategies using, advanced tax strategies. So you're boosting your returns on the other end, not really, and waiting for the cash flow to catch up, because over time your cash flow is going to increase because of inflation. So you can use the tax strategies and you can use something like short-term rentals with the higher returns, or you can combine the two and combine a rehab into that and add value and force appreciation. But there's so much you can do to strategize around generating, again, those significant cash flows, even in this market, right? But again, importantly, when you're starting out, make sure you understand the regulations, make sure you know what your path is going to be. You may be willing to put in the effort this year, but you may want to shift strategies a few years from now. So really know where you want to be and plan accordingly. Members within Creating Generational Freedom, they use co-hosts. That's a way to be a little more active and control how active you want to be in your portfolio, so you can still take advantage of those tax strategies. Some of them use property management from day one, but they just wanted to be hands-off and still get that high cash flow without really tapping into those tax strategies. And some of these teams that we work with, especially, the agent works with these property managers and interior designers who help you furnish the property without really going crazy over it, right? Even if you don't really care about design. So many ways to do it. And I want you to just open yourself up to those possibilities. But more importantly, run those numbers right. Use the calculator. Again, it's Generational Wealth MD, the website, if you go to the resources portion, there's a calculator for short-term rentals. There's also a calculator there for long-term rentals. So if you want that to be your exit strategy and you want to make sure the numbers make sense for both, run the numbers for both. Make sure the numbers make sense. Be conservative in running numbers and always double check the numbers that are given to you, because I've seen people manipulate the numbers multiple ways. So it's always safe to run your own numbers. But again, I just want to say, end with the fact that so many people, just like you, physicians who really are just starting out, have, after joining the program, within a month, locked in short-term rentals and I've seen them grow over time. They've generated, like I said, 7 to 10,000 in cash flow from one property, right? And this is like an average over the time frame, right? Not just in those peak seasons. They're doing it comfortably with that lower down payment while sheltering hundreds of thousands of dollars from taxes. So yeah, can it be a game changer? Yes, it can be a game changer, and you get to pick and choose how much effort you want to put into it, how much risk you want to assume. So like everything else with real estate, even within the short-term rental space, I've noticed that it's not just like a one thing. You get to pick, even within that, which kind of submarket you want to be in, how conservative you want to be. So hopefully this has given you guys a lot of ideas in terms of how you can use short-term rentals within your portfolio. And I'm excited to see what you guys do within the next few years. Okay, so let's go to taking some questions. Hi, Florine, how are you doing? Hey Neil, the 10% down loan products are quoting. Yes, there have been shifts. The rates have gone up, but this is the first time I'm hearing 7%. I didn't hear anything upwards of 4% for the second home loans. That's interesting. I'm wondering if that's lender specific also. The 10% down loans, Henry, you can use them depending on, so I think within a sub-market, you can only have one of those loan products at any given time. And I know people go, and this is why they invest in multiple markets, so they're able to use those 10% down loans. And I've also heard of some members, what they do is they get it with a 10% down loan, and then the next property, they may decide to use asset-based lending with 25 or 20% down. But they get different loan products over there. Even if you aren't able to qualify, you've hit your DTI or something. So many ways to work around it. But you have other loan products that you could consider, which are also long-term fixed loan products. Okay. I think there's a conversation going there. So will managing your LTR count towards the 500 hours? So the thing with long-term rentals and short-term rentals, Henry, is that material participation has to be separate for the two. So if you have multiple short-term rentals, you are able to club your short-term rentals, you group them. You can group your long-term rentals, you can group your short-term rentals, and you can use all the hours you spend within that group to qualify for material participation, but you can't switch between the long-term and the short-term rentals in terms of clubbing your hours for material participation. I hope that clarifies that. And then there's another question about spouses combining hours for material participation. Spouses can combine hours for material participation. They cannot combine hours for real estate professional status. So Daval, I think it says 45% fee for property management. Sounds like super, super high. So tell me this, if you are an investor and someone is taking 45% of your gross revenue, that's not even net revenue for property management, that would really, I would look at other options. People go anywhere from 15 to 30%. It tends to be more standard. And then I would look into like self-managing, because you're saving so much more. Hey Dor, I see Dor and Henry are in the spring cohort of creating generational freedom, and they are like getting all excited. I'm so excited for us to start next weekend. So Dor, your question is, do out-of-state short-term rentals make sense? Absolutely, Dor. In the fall cohort of creating generational freedom, we have so many members who were self-managing out-of-state short-term rentals, and we have teams within the program where they can manage it for you, and so it absolutely doesn't have to be, and they can furnish it and take care of all of that. You could easily invest out of state, but even if you wanted to self-manage, that's completely doable. Yes, flying to the property does count as a business expense. Now, in terms of commute to the property, so that's a gray zone. Some people will say that when you fly to the property or you drive, even if it's 8 hours, all of those hours count towards material participation. I always say log it. The more conservative CPAs will say if the commute or the flight is more than 2 hours, then the IRS may frown upon it. But what you're going to do is you're going to log it, and you want to shoot above the material participation requirement, so that even if they flag you, you have more hours to to keep your to audit proof your material participation hours. Okay, how long can the property be vacant for that honestly doesn't matter. If it's vacant, it if it's off season, you have long periods of vacancy, it doesn't matter, as long as the average guest stay. And so to be more conservative, if you have one person having 2 different stays, and that all the days count towards 1 stay, and you want the average number of guest stays to be 7 days or less. So I always say, especially if you're doing it end of the year, I like to say be super conservative. Hi, Sari, it's so nice to see you here. Hope you're doing well, because I know Sari used the short-term rental strategy when she was trying to build her portfolio. So Maureen, that's a great question. Can you use the short-term rental for personal use when it's not rented? You can use it. There are limitations in the year that you're trying to get bonus depreciation, and you want to take full advantage of those tax savings. In that year, you don't want your stay to exceed 14 days or greater than 10% of the number of greater than 10% of the number of days the property was a short-term rental in that year. So as long as you make sure that, because then what happens is that you can still do it, you just won't be able to get the 100% bonus depreciation on that property. That's all. But if you're traveling to the property, you're spending 4 hours on the property doing work on the property, that's considered a business day. You log that as a business day, and then so if you strategize around that, you can possibly use it more. But I believe in the year where you're not trying to do bonus depreciation, you should be able to use the short-term rental more. I would confirm that with your CPA though. Maya, does the 500 hours have to be towards one short-term? I think we just covered that also, right? On a previous question, you have the ability to group multiple short-term rentals into one unit, and then you just need to materially participate in the unit as a whole. So if you have 3 properties and 3 short-term rentals, right, and you've spent 500 hours over those 3, then you do the grouping election. Now, the downside with the grouping election is that it's not reversible. So I would talk to your CPA. For most people, it still makes sense to do it, but you really need to know what the implications are based on whether you intend to sell something and whether you have a lot of carried forward passive losses. It may not make the most sense for you. So you want to really talk to your CPA, make sure that you're not going to. So the strategy makes sense. So you're not going to lose out because of doing that. That's the only thing. But for most people, it makes sense. So Henry, yes, when you come into the program, we talk about all the different softwares, but a software that I really like to use, and I use it as an app on my phone so that on the go I'm logging hours. I like using Clockify. There are other apps we talk about, but that's the one that I use. So they local regulations. You start on multiple levels. You can Google and find out zoning ordinances. If there's anything in place, you can call your county clerk's office and ask them if they can direct you to the office that can give you information about zoning. And what else? And then HOA. If there is an HOA. So remember that the HOA can always change regulations on you. So just because they're okay with it now doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. There are HOAs even in. One of our members, she got a property in the Florida Panhandle. They changed the regulations, even in that vacation rental friendly market. They changed the regulations to the point where her guest stays had to be 7 days or longer, which is fine. She's doing great with it, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. So if you have the option of picking something without an HOA, that may make more sense, but it's not always an option. Okay. Hey, Hang, how are you doing? Okay, guys, this was great. It looks like we're at the end of our questions. Guys, if you have any more questions, feel free to pop them in there and tag me so that I'll always come back to it and answer. But thank you everyone for hopping on. I hope this information was useful, and I hope you are motivated to use short-term rentals as part of your growth strategy in your real estate portfolio. Take care, guys.